Thank you, Brenda, and thank you for the organizers of this meeting for inviting me. So I'm Mary Thanh Hai, Deputy Director for Clinical, and I'm really excited to talk to you about this topic, selective safety data collection in clinical trials. I was also the rapporteur for the expert work group that worked together with many regulatory agencies and industry representatives as part of the International Council for Harmonization to develop the E19, ICH E19 guideline. So what I'm hoping that you will actually get out of my presentation today are the following things. First, to understand what is selective safety data collection, to understand the importance of ICH E19 guideline to selective safety data collection, and particularly in global drug development. And finally, to describe situations where and how selective safety data collection can be implemented in drug development. I'm hoping that there actually be other learnings in here as well, but I'm only going to cover these three here as the learning objectives in the final questions and answer, polling question, excuse me. So the outline of my presentation will first cover defining what is selective safety data collection. I'm going to give you some background for the development of E19. I'm going to talk about the scope of E19, and when I talk about the scope of E19, it's specific to the guideline or the guidance, the FDA guidance. An important part is actually what is the purpose of safety monitoring clinical trials. This is going to be that balance between safety monitoring and what E19 or selective safety data collection entails. And then I'm also going to talk about what we mean when we talk about reduction in data collection, or what data really should generally always be collected. And then I'll also talk about possible trial scenarios and methodologies for implementing E19. Oops, why is this going so quickly? And then I'll conclude remarks in the next steps. So first, what is selective safety data collection? I'm just going to say SSDC. SSDC refers to the prospectively planned reduction and collection of certain types of data in a clinical trial for drugs with a well-characterized safety profile where continued collection of comprehensive data may provide only limited additional knowledge of clinical importance. So a couple of things I want to emphasize here in this definition. Prospectively planned reduction. That's really important. You have to think about this, whether or not it's appropriate in your clinical trial. The other thing that's important is a well-characterized safety profile. So this is not a one-size-fits-all. This is not every drug, every clinical trial can actually implement SSDC. And really the last part is that once you get to that stage, you've already planned it, you actually know that this is a well-characterized safety profile for a drug. What is the gain that you have in this? Because if you fit those criteria, continued collection of all safety data that is comprehensive may actually not add so much more to the knowledge in terms of doing an assessment with respect to benefit and risk of that therapy in the indication in the clinical trial that you're investigating. So SSDC or E19 is really an innovative approach to clinical drug development, conduct of clinical trials. It's innovative, but it's not something that hasn't been done before. And so it's something that I really want to emphasize, that while this is innovative, it is not so novel that we need to be concerned so that we don't have experience with it. And I will talk about how we do have experience, and I'm not sure why it's moving forward. And the reason why I say that, some of you may have actually heard about SSDC, particularly at FDA, because we actually had issued a final guidance in 2016 entitled Determining the Extent of Safety Data Collection Needed in Late-Stage Pre-Market and Post-Approval Clinical Investigations. And I remember when this guidance came out, I was at that time the Division Director for Metabolic and Endocrine, and we had a lot of clinical trials that are being conducted to evaluate cardiovascular safety, both in the pre-approval and post-approval. Most of it was in the post-approval stage. And speaking with industry representatives and saying, have you heard about this guidance? Because you're focusing just on cardiovascular safety. You can implement some degree of focused, targeted safety data collection. And some of the things I heard back was, yes, Mary, we're aware about that guidance. However, not everybody in FDA actually is aware of that guidance. But the other thing here is that it's an FDA guidance. Our drug development program is global. And so, we can do that here for you, but we can't necessarily do that in Japan or in Europe. So that leads to the question, why was E19 proposed for development as the ICH guideline? It was proposed because, for the reason I just referred to, is that drug development is a global endeavor. And there really was an important need to have alignment between regulators and industry. It was essential to advance those principles that were laid out in a previously published FDA guidance on this topic. And just to talk a little bit about the ICH process, it started in 2017, and it involved not just the founding members, regulatory members, so that would be the US, EMA, and also Japan, but there are others since then, regulatory agencies that are part of it, and also their industry representatives. The expert work group was comprised of about 30 people working together over a period of about 5 years, meeting on an annual basis. Initially it was in Montreal, and then to Geneva, Switzerland, and then we came back to North Carolina, and we were actually also in Japan and Singapore. So it wasn't a painful process. It was actually a wonderful opportunity to work with many of our colleagues to actually get this across the finish line. This is moving too quickly, to actually get a harmonized guideline. And what the objectives of E19 was, first, to provide recommendations regarding appropriate use of a selective approach to safety data collection in some late stage or post-marketing studies of drugs where the safety profile with respect to commonly occurring adverse events is well understood and documented. And the thought here is that by tailoring that method of safety data collection, it may enable greater efficiency in the conduct of clinical trials, and that this may facilitate the conduct of large efficacy and safety clinical trials with a large number of participants and long-term follow-up. And as I mentioned, it was a 5-year process. We crossed the finish line. We got to step 4 of the ICH process in September of 2022, when we actually published the finalized ICH E19. And shortly after that, we're now in step 5. Shortly after that, FDA issued its final guidance in December, and this is signaling that FDA is now implementing ICH E19. Other regulatory agencies have done so as well. And the scope of E19 are the following. First, it's to interventional clinical trials. Most often it's in the post-approval trials. But in some circumstances, it can also be considered for pre-approval trials. It's not applicable to gene therapy or rare orphan disease clinical trials. And what I'm saying here is that the scope of the guideline, what we focus on when we wrote that guideline, we did not actually target gene therapy or rare orphan disease clinical trials. Certainly, I can entertain questions if that comes up about applying it here. And then finally, SSDC needs to follow the principles. If you follow the principles of SSDC in the guidance, it must also need to understand it does not alter your local regional safety reporting requirements. So what is the purpose of actually safety monitoring? It has 2 purposes. First is to protect the safety and well-being of individual trial participants. And the second is to obtain safety information to be used in the assessment of the risk profile of the investigational medicinal product. Now, at this point, you may ask, well, there seems to be a conflict when you define SSDC, and now you're saying that the whole purpose of monitoring safety in a clinical trial is to protect safety of the patients and obtain safety information. But if this is actually a prospectively planned reduction in collection of safety data, how do you achieve that? And you achieve that because, remember, you need to understand that your drug has a well-characterized safety profile. It does not mean that the investigator or the healthcare provider's responsibility to the patient is in any way at all removed. They still have that responsibility to ensure the safety of the patient. So that's the monitoring aspect of it. But the collection and the reporting of safety information that would not add any further to the understanding of the benefit risk of the drug does not need to be collected onto the CRFs and reported to regulatory agencies. So that's where there isn't a disconnect. It's just to make it very clear that this does not in any way at all take away the obligation to the investigator to ensure safety in the patient population. So when is the safety profile of a drug well understood and documented? The guidance does list several factors for consideration, but it's not considered to be an exhaustive list or determinative. So as a starting point, what is the regulatory status of the drug? So as an example, has the drug already been approved? That makes sense because if it's already been approved, it has actually already gone through a regulatory review process and an understanding of the safety profile. Now, one is the mechanistic factors of the drug. Do we know the mechanism of action, including any untoward effects? Is it one of many in a class, or is it first in class? If it's one in many, you may actually know a lot about the class of drug itself. What about the clinical safety database of the drug? What are the number and duration of exposure, the dose, intensity of the safety monitoring of that clinical safety database? And what's the similarity of the planned clinical trial where you intend to implement SSDC to previous trials? So how similar is it with respect to the patient population, the dosing regimen? The further away you get from the further away, I'm sorry. Note to self, animation sometimes can be problematic. The further you get away from the knowledge or the evidence that leads you to make the conclusion of a well-characterized safety profile, the harder it is to implement SSDC. The other thing that to consider is the clinical pharmacology. What do you know about how that drug is metabolized, how it's absorbed? Drug-drug interactions is important as well. The non-clinical data from the safety and pharmacologic effects, are they well characterized from animal studies or non-clinical studies? And if it's already an approved drug, what do we have with respect to post-authorization data, the extent and the quality of the post-marketing safety data? So when it has been determined and agreed to with regulatory authorities that SSDC may be appropriate for clinical trial, collection of certain information may be limited or reduced in frequency of collection. And this needs to be specified in the protocol. Another point to emphasize here is that really selective safety data collection is something that you propose in a protocol and you get agreement with the regulatory agencies. So things that you might be able to reduce or eliminate or reduce in frequency of collection, some of the non-serious adverse events, some laboratory monitoring, physical exams and vital sign data, or concomitant medications. And I have an asterisk here to point out that if a serious adverse event actually does occur, or an adverse event of special interest, some of this information that's actually that you can reduce, you would probably want to collect it in the surrounding of a particular serious adverse event to better characterize or understand that event, to investigate that event. The other thing to understand is that even if you're going to reduce some of those events and collection during the trial, they really need to be collected at baseline. So at baseline, comprehensive safety data collection is important because you need to understand the patient's profile. Should something happen, there can be a better understanding in terms of change from baseline. Also, importantly, generally, one should expect that the following will be collected: serious adverse events, important medical events, medication errors or overdose, intentional or unintentional, adverse events that lead to a study drug discontinuation, pregnancy and lactation exposure and their outcome, and adverse events of special interest, including lab abnormalities. And this, again, is identified in the protocol. So what are the situations where selective safety data collection can be considered? An approved drug that is seeking a new indication in a similar population to the one that is already approved. An example here could be a drug that's actually been approved for reduction in risk in atherosclerotic cardiovascular disease, and now the company comes in and they want to expand the indication for reduction in risk of peripheral vascular disease. Another situation could be it's an approved drug that's seeking to expand the label to include additional endpoints in the same patient population. So an example, let's say a drug that's actually approved for the reduction in hospitalization due to heart failure. And now they actually want to come in that same population to get some claim with respect to a patient-reported outcome, some quality of life claim in the label. Another one is a safety trial with an objective to investigate specific safety concern. This is particularly in the setting of, on the FDA side, FDAA requirements and PMRs. I mentioned that when we had the 2016 guidance, there were a lot of cardiovascular safety trials being conducted in the diabetes space. Well, there was very, very focused on one particular or particular safety events, and that's where it could be targeted. Some of the other non-serious or safety issues may not be as important to collect, and you can reduce collection in those other events. And finally, you can also consider it where you have a trial that's designed to provide additional evidence of efficacy when the current available data support a well-characterized safety profile. Now, this one here needs a little bit of explanation here. Let's say, for example, you actually have a product, an application before the agency, and it had two trials in order to demonstrate substantial evidence of effectiveness. One trial was positive, the other one was not. And there are maybe a variety of reasons why the other one was not. But either way, because of that, it could not be approved because it had not met the statutory requirement of showing substantial evidence of effectiveness. However, in both those trials and the whole program, there was enough information to understand the safety profile of the drug. In this situation, the company would be told you need to do another study to actually demonstrate substantial evidence of effectiveness, but you can reduce some of your safety collection. And that's an important consideration, because it just means that important second trial that they have to do, a third trial they have to do, they can focus on actually showing efficacy. They've already convinced us, at least of the safety profile. Now, so what are the possible approaches to implementing SSDC in a clinical trial? The first one is just selective safety data collection in everyone, probably the easiest way of implementing it in the protocol and operationalizing it. Another one is to do a comprehensive collection for a specific subset, but you can have SSDC and the rest. A situation here would be if in your safety database, you don't have enough information on a subset of the population. Let's say the elderly patient population. You might want to have a comprehensive safety data collection in the elderly population, but the rest you can do SSDC. You can also have comprehensive collection everyone initially and SSDC thereafter. A scenario here would be an LDL cholesterol lowering drug. It gets approved just on LDL cholesterol lowering, but pre-approval, they've actually initiated their cardiovascular outcomes trial. Since the drug hasn't been approved yet, they are going to implement comprehensive collection, but as they get to approval, they begin to know a lot more about the drug. After approval, they may consider implementing SSDC after approval. And then finally, another approach is comprehensive collection in a representative subset and SSDC for remainder patients. So this can be done a random sample of patients or a random selection of regions where you can have SSDC in some and comprehensive in another. Either way, the approach really, again, needs to be spelled out in the protocol. So as I mentioned before, SSDC or E19, well, E19 is novel in the sense that it was just recently finalized and being implemented. SSDC itself is not necessarily something that has not been done before. It actually has. And what I have here on the slide here is a publication by actually two of my colleagues on the expert work group, Yukiko Watabe and Hironori Sakai, the senior authors in this paper. They are from Japan Manufacturing Association, Pharmaceutical Manufacturing Association. And they actually wanted to evaluate the landscape in clinical trials in New England Journal of Medicine to see whether there was any mention in the publication about the study that could have been implementation of SSDC. And this was done in advance of us actually, I think it was step 2, when we actually issued a draft guideline for public comment. Their approach, they did a literature search of trials that were published in the New England Journal of Medicine from a period of February of 2016 through December of 2019. This was the time frame before the guideline was actually published in draft form. And they reviewed the text and protocols and the SAPs of these trials to identify if there were any terms that would suggest it was adoption of selective safety data collection. And how they defined it was that these were trials that would not necessarily collect some of the adverse events that were commonly collected in clinical trials. And what they found was that out of 459 papers, the results of clinical trials, 9.6% of them actually had some terminology identified as adopting selective safety data collection. What's also interesting about the 44 trials in this time frame was that in terms of the therapeutic area, more than half of them were in the cardiovascular space. And most of them were cardiovascular outcomes trials. So they were very focused on identifying either a benefit or evaluating a safety concern. It was followed by infectious disease and then oncology. And then the other interesting thing is that over 90% of these trials were actually conducted before 2017. So well in advance of ICH E19 actually being published. So some key considerations before implementing selective safety data collection. First, is the safety profile of the drug well characterized? Do the study objectives and design of the trial support selective safety data collection? And then finally, has agreement been reached with regulatory agency on the protocol implementing selective safety data collection? So where are we right now, the next step? E19 is at step 5 of the ICH process, which means that since the guideline is finalized, it's all the different regulatory agencies and will now have to implement it according to their own protocol within their specific region or country. And I list here the members and regions where ICH E19 has been implemented. I haven't looked at the site, but you can go to the site to actually see if anything has been updated. But this is really exciting because, as I mentioned, in 2016, there was just the FDA guidance. And in spite of just being FDA, there were already some trials, which I'm willing to bet that if you look at those trials, they were global trials as well, where it's been implemented. But to have this actually signed on by many different regulatory agencies, this is really an opportunity for us to continue to promote this more broadly. I know that when we actually reach step 4, and essentially when you get to that point, the expert work group is disbanded. It was really a wonderful work group to develop this guideline on. But as a group, we really felt that this was something that was important as a guideline or guidance that shouldn't actually just collect dust on the shelf, that we need to really get this out and encourage companies and sponsors to actually consider this in their clinical drug development program. Hence the conversation today I'm having with all of you. And on that note, I do want to actually talk a little bit about the efforts that the FDA has to further promote selective safety data collection. As you may have heard, we announced in April the establishment of C3TI, the Center for Trial Innovation, which you'll hear a little bit more from my colleague in the next presentation. But E19, or selective safety data collection, was identified as a demonstration project. So if you on this particular slide here has some information. You can learn more about the guidance itself through a podcast. There's a summary of the guidance snapshot. But importantly is that any company that thinks that there's an opportunity for a clinical trial there's to implement SSDC, we would really encourage you to reach out to the agency to have a discussion on whether or not it would be appropriate to be part of a demonstration project and engagement more closely with the agency, and also to help facilitate any interactions with other regulatory agencies that would also need to sign on to an E19 approach for the trial. So in conclusion, ICH E19 guideline will have a significant impact on the feasibility and efficiency of clinical trials designed to yield important new medical knowledge and advance public health. So now let's see how I did in the learning objectives. So your first challenge question, selective safety data collection refers to A, eliminating safety data collection entirely in a trial with a drug that has a well-established safety profile. B, prospectively planned reduction in collection of certain types of data in a clinical trial for drugs with a well-characterized safety profile. And finally, C, only collecting safety information in patients who experience an adverse event. And not AN, not A and D. So I don't know if, is there a voting mechanism now? Will people raise their hands? Just raise hands. Okay, so let me just go through again. So who says selective safety data collection refers to A, eliminating safety data collection entirely in a trial with a drug that has a well-established safety profile? Excellent. B, prospectively planned reduction and collection of certain types of data in a clinical trial for drugs with a well-characterized safety profile. Excellent, very good. That was the right answer. And obviously the last one, only collecting safety information patients. No. All right, second question. I hope this one's a little bit more challenging. Which scenario would not be appropriate for SSDC? A, an already approved drug for reduction of cardiovascular disease risk in type 2 diabetes is now being studied for reduction in peripheral vascular disease in type 2 diabetes. B, a phase 2 dose response study of a first-in-class immunomodulator being developed for the treatment of pediatric dermatoses. And C, a post-approval safety trial evaluating the risk of renal failure where the only safety signal of concern pre-approval was imbalances in serum creatinine elevation. So again, the question is, which scenario would not be appropriate for SSDC? It's always those negative questions. So is A not appropriate for SSDC? Anybody raise their hand? B is a phase 2 dose response study of a first-in-class immunomodulator being developed for the treatment of pediatric dermatosis. Is that not appropriate for SSDC? Okay, got some hands up. And then C, a post-approval safety trial evaluating the risk of renal failure where the only safety signal of concern pre-approval were imbalances in serum creatinine elevation. Is that one not appropriate for SSDC? Okay, there were some folks who didn't want to commit, but the show of hands, the only show of hands was for B, which is the correct answer. It's a phase 2 dose response study of a first-in-class immunomodulator, so you probably don't know a whole lot about of the safety profile of the drug at the phase 2 stage, also first-in-class. I threw in there the pediatric dermatosis, the pediatric population. The guideline doesn't actually exclude pediatric studies, but I think that there's probably always going to be a little bit more caution in a more vulnerable patient population. So with that, I am happy to entertain any questions.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Thanh Hai. All right, so we know, I'm sorry?
Do you want me to sit down?
You can have a seat if you want to be more comfortable. Can she have a seat? She's not mic'd up. I've forgotten, yeah. I'm just delirious with happiness, yeah. Okay. All right. Okay, questions in the room?
Yeah.
Please, we have two mics, so please, if you want to come up to another mic, please.
Yeah, thank you for that. I'm happy to see ICH E19 moving forward that way. I know there's been trials back in 2012. I worked on trying to get FDA, convince them to reduce collection. My question is really a logistical question, is how do you manage a protocol, like a free-form response of how you feel? Because they're always going to answer maybe something that was not part of what you're restricting in terms of data collection. So that's my first thing. The second thing is, when I thought of reducing data collection, it was more like data reporting. So we would have the data, but we wouldn't actually report it to the agencies. It would always be in the case report forms or somewhere. So I'm just curious about the differences there and how you actually implement that on the case report form to you just, if there's a free form part of that to answer about how do you feel?
Thank you for that question. So actually specifically in the guideline, and I didn't put it in the slide, but when we talk about SSDC and E19, it's about the collection of the information on the case report form and then to actually report it to the regulatory agencies. And it was very specific in that setting there because we know that if sponsors are telling their investigators that you need to actually collect and capture this in the case report forms, that is actually additional work that you do. You have to actually solicit that information. The question you really have to ask is that, why do you need to solicit that information? That's very different from monitoring. And whether or not, if you're going to collect it, then you're going to have to feel the obligation of actually reporting it to the regulatory agencies. So that was the distinction I was making with respect to selective safety data collection. If you don't think that this is something, whatever the safety, I shouldn't say the adverse event, whatever the safety information is, whether it be EKGs or physical exams, that's not necessarily a safety information, but it's a test or a procedure that you're doing. If you don't think that that's actually necessary to continue to ensure the safety of the patient, then that's not something that needs to be put in the protocol to collect in the CRF. And if you don't have it in the CRF, you won't be reporting it to the agency. So I hope that actually answers your question. And I forgot your first question. I'm sorry.
It just had to do with, if you ask the free-form question, the investigator says, how do you feel? Then some of these issues may come up. Do they not get put on the case report form then if the investigator is asking a question, how do you feel? Which is pretty typical in a clinical trial.
So I'm not sure if I understand. So you're asking the investigator, how do they feel? Or you're talking about the patient?
The patient. So
Oh.
the investigator asks how you feel, and the patient writes down some of these things that are not part of data collection. They go into some other. Are they not then reported, or are they just? They're in the case report form at that point. We've limited reporting on some of the adverse events I've worked on. I'm just curious, how you manage that.
Well, so I think how I'm going to answer this without trying to actually get into advising on a particular drug development program, because I don't know the details of it. I'm going to assume that as an investigator, when your patient or the participant comes in, I would assume that's just a good patient physician practice, is to ask, how are you doing? How have you been since the last visit? And they may, talk about a lot of things. Again, it's protocol defined. Remember, it's prospectively planned decision in terms of what's going to be collected and what's going to be reported. If the patient actually said, well, since the last time I was in, I had such and such, and as the investigator, you are the investigator, by the way, it is a requirement that they have to be trained and have the expertise to be able to carry out the objectives or the protocol and objectives of the trial. If they determine based on their scientific knowledge that this is not an essential part of ensuring the safety of the patient and it's not in the protocol, then that wouldn't be something that's going to be reported to the agency. Does that help?
Next question to my left, please.
She's first. You want first?
We're alternating.
Okay. So I have a question about how do you define the safety collection for the trial with infant, children, and adult?
Okay, so selective safety data collection, infants.
For infant trial, children trial, and then adult trial.
Okay. Well, the criteria, or as I mentioned, the things that you have to absolutely be sure is you feel that the trial or the drug has a well-established safety profile. And then after that, then the question is, can that be applied to the trial and the patient population? So if you actually have a drug that has a well-established safety profile, but it's never been studied in the pediatric population, it's probably something that you would not be comfortable. And the other thing here is that you obviously need to have buy-in from the regulatory agencies as well. You would need to make that justification that the population that's going to be studied, and where in a trial where you want to implement SSDC, you have enough data from prior studies, prior evidence, and I gave you a whole long list that is not determinative but can be helpful. If none of those actually can be applied to the new patient population, it's probably not something that you want to implement in a pediatric or a neonatal population. Does that help?
Yeah, that's helpful. Yeah, that we experience with COVID vaccine also. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Let's go online for a question, please, and then we'll come back.
How would a sponsor reach agreement with FDA on the protocol implementing SSDC? What is the best way, and how long would it take for FDA to reach a decision regarding if SSDC is acceptable?
Okay, so that's a very good question. So this would be implemented as part of a protocol, and most likely it will be let's say a pivotal trial. I suppose one could actually make an argument it doesn't have to be a pivotal trial, but more likely it'll be a pivotal trial. Protocols would be submitted to the agency. You could flag it with specific questions, as a submission to the agency. And I can't remember the exact time frame, but usually the time frame in terms of responding to these types of questions is probably in a period of 45 days to 2 months. Because there's an understanding if it's a pivotal trial, we don't want to wait too long because companies actually need to be able to get this understanding to move forward with that. Certainly if this is something that you want to implement in a phase 3 program, you can certainly bring it up in a phase 2 meeting as well, where you may not have the protocol all spelled out, but you want to flag for the agency when we're planning on implementing selective safety data collection, and we will also be sending in the protocol. So those are different ways that you can approach the FDA about this being put into the protocol and getting feedback on it.
Thank you. Let's go. If you want to step up a little bit close to the mic.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
So this is actually very similar to the question that was raised online. Considering that this guidance has been around since 2016, have you already received protocols with this SSDC? Second part is, now that it is part of demonstration project, how is it different? Could we just submit the protocol with the reduced safety data collection for a post-approval study under our IND? Or what is the pros and cons of doing it via the demonstration project versus to the IND? Thank you.
So very good questions. The first one, are we receiving it? We have not established a database or a process to systematically identify these as they come in. That's something we're working on. I think that's really important. It's nice to track to see that I'm hoping to see an increase on it. And I'm hoping that the efforts like from today or other meetings, by the way, I don't know if anyone's going to DIA in June, but there will be a session on E19 as well, that getting that message out there, we will see an increase on that. So the second question is, what is the benefit of being in a demonstration project versus actually submitting it to an IND and getting agreement? And I'm going to actually, I don't know if Dr. Bugan will respond to that in his talk. I think the benefit is that you'd have greater interaction engagement with SMEs within the agency at many different levels to give you feedback on that protocol. And particularly if this is a very challenging one, you may have to engage also with other regulatory agencies. It would have to be accepted in the program. The other aspect there is that there has to be an understanding that if you're accepted into the demonstration project, there is a willingness on the sponsor's part to actually publicly share those learnings with the public. And that's really important. If you think about MIDD and CID and also the drug development tool qualification program, you heard that from Rob Caleb this morning. He's talking about all the different approaches that the agency has for innovation. It doesn't help if you have innovation, but you only keep it close to your chest and you don't share it. So it's really important to agree to share that with others so they can say, this actually does work, or it didn't work. What can we learn from? Why did it not work? So it's not always the success stories that we want to share. Sometimes we have to share things that didn't go well so we can make improvements on it. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Thank you. Let's go with the second question in-house because you've been standing there for a little while.
Thank you for the wonderful presentation and informative discussion on the selective safety data. I wanted to take things a little bit to a different level. We are seeing and experiencing a lot of activities in clinical trials that are happening remotely with the modernization of clinical trials, and with that, the use of technologies to enable these trials. So in terms of, in that context, are there provisions from the agency perspective to deal with the selective safety data collection centrally versus remotely, and in the context of E19 and others?
Okay, so how do we apply, if I can paraphrase, how would we be able to apply selective safety data collection in different novel ways of conducting trials, such as remote monitoring
Yeah.
or decentralized trials or digital health technology. Does that sound?
Yes, or even real world evidence. I mean, yes.
Okay. Well, I think first and foremost, from selective safety data collection, you need to, I'm going to sound like a broken record, but you need to be sure that you have confidence in the safety profile of the drug and you know what you need to collect and what you don't need to collect. So once you have that, then the question is, the things that you are going to collect because you think that it's important, that's where you're going to implement more novel approaches collecting, whether it be remote monitoring or digital health technologies. That's perhaps a different area that you have to address because you still need quality data in that setting there. So if you're going to, let's say, still collect a particular adverse event, but your intent here is to collect it through some DHT, some tool that's novel, there still has to be an understanding that that tool can actually adequately collect that information, that it's reliable. So that speaks to the quality of the data. So SSDC does not absolve you of that obligation at all, and sponsors will still need to make sure that that new technology can actually deliver on that. I think where the two will really go hand in hand is that when you start to reduce collection of unnecessary information, you actually make it more feasible to do things such as decentralized trial, remote monitoring, because it may mean that patients don't have to come in every month. They can come in on a 6-month basis. And if some of those events that are still considered necessary to ensure adequate assessment of benefit and risk, if those fewer events that are being collected can actually then be done in a remote setting, it does facilitate, it does go hand in hand. Does that?
It's okay. We can discuss later. Thank you.
Okay, sure.
Thank you very much. This was our last question. If you have more questions for Dr. Thanh Hai, please get her in. You'll be around a little bit.
Yes, until lunch.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.